Hi, this is On Mind with Andrew Archer. Today, our guest is Dr. Darald Hanusa. Darald Hanusa has a PhD in clinical social work. He's also certified alcohol and drug abuse counselor, certified batterer treatment provider. He's been a senior preceptor and lecturer at the School of Social Work for the University of Wisconsin-Madison. That's one of our connections because I did my schooling there. So I'll save some of the bio for you, Dr. Hanusa, but clinically, he's specialized in the area of domestic violence with both perpetrators and survivors of violence since 1980. October is Domestic Violence Month, and we had Julia Hamann on before this to talk about some of the structures of violence. And the specific thing that I think will be interesting to talk about today is the ATOM program. It stands for Alternatives and Treatment for Abusive Men. He's the founder of Midwest Center for Human Services, where I had the pleasure of working for several years in Madison, Wisconsin. And he offers services in both English and Spanish. Welcome, Darald. Anything you want to add in terms of your background, bio?
No, I think you covered the bases pretty well. I have, in addition to what you mentioned, I was one of the crafters of the Wisconsin Batterers Treatment Providers Association, which certifies facilitators who work with domestic violence harm doers. I was also one of the founders of the Dane County Task Force on Domestic Violence. So just a couple additions to what you've already said, but I think you covered most of it pretty well.
But you're sort of started at the origins of this type of treatment, right?
Yeah, back when I started doing this, I actually started in 1978 with Dan Saunders and Jeff Edelson. And back then, there weren't any programs with exception of maybe 4 others nationally. So we were one of 5 programs who started doing this work. And I will say that it's been a real journey over time. And even the language we use today has changed. We used to call them abusers, perpetrators, batterers, and we've kind of moved on from that language to call them intimate partner harm doers and male harm doers versus batterers, which is designed to reflect a little bit more humanity and compassion for the people we work with. Because one of the things that we've learned over the years is that even though the people we work with, the harm doers we work with, have done and engaged in domestic violence and intimate partner violence, which is not necessarily a good thing. They also have their own histories, their own traumas that we only in the field have started to recognize. So actually, I've been kind of a pioneer in that regard because I have worked with issues of trauma-based shame with harm doers for going on 30 years at a time when no one else was even doing this work. And I will say that when I started doing this, it was controversial. I got a lot of pushback from the DV community that I was being compassionate to these guys and tuning into their feelings.
I bet.
But it really made a world of difference in terms of the work that I did.
So just a step back, how would you define domestic and or intimate partner violence just in a general way for people to understand?
Well, it's really interesting you asked that question because the harm doers that I work with come into treatment and they don't know how to define it either. And most of them say that, well, I've never been abusive to my partner. And then I go through the woman abuse scale, which is a modified conflict tactic scale developed by Marie Strauss that Dan Saunders and I did when we were doing some research for the National Institute on Mental Health on outcome for treatment. But basically, broadly defined, domestic violence can be categorized as a method of controlling behavior that involves psychological, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse, and certainly the most common is physical abuse, anything from pushing, slapping, grabbing to severe forms of violence. And again, the harm doers that I work with, they come in and they're willing to admit to the psychological abuse. And they say to me, well, that's not abuse. Everybody does that. They'll talk about physical abuse to some extent as well. But they don't understand that psychological abuse is not any less severe. In some respects, it's even more severe because the injuries, of course, are internal, and the words that they use and the put downs and name calling and sarcastic comment hurt and linger for a long time. So it is really a pattern of behavior designed to control one's partner that is beyond single episodes. It's kind of a pattern, and it includes all the things I just mentioned.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And correct me if I'm wrong, but this is a generational problem. You know, I volunteered in the prison system in Wisconsin, and the mindfulness teachers that I would work with, they would use the phrase "hurt people hurt people." Is that experience? And is that your experience in terms of the adversity, the trauma that these men have experienced?
Well, that's I mean, we certainly talk about it that way, but I mean, for many, many years in this field, people were unwilling to look at perpetrators and now harm doers as people who were hurt. They just focused on the fact that they hurt other people. And thankfully, over time, people have begun to understand it, particularly when it comes to their own family of origin issues and trauma and trauma-based shame, that these people are hurt. And when they get into their shame mode, they aren't able to access the tools that you teach them. And that's one of the ways that I've added some important treatment elements to the work that I do, and for people nationally to learn from that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I know you pull a lot from studying and I think getting certifications in some of Brene Brown's shame-based, you know, treatment and compassion and stuff, correct?
Right. Well, I actually started doing the work on shame probably close to 30 years ago. I was actually doing work on shame before Brene Brown was even out of high school. But I really love her. I really love her information. I love the way she frames it. And so I've added to what I was already doing using some of her language. And I was interested enough in her work that I went and got certified. I did a training with her team in San Antonio, Texas years ago, and became certified to be a group facilitator in her shame model. And so it's been great. I really love her work and how she packages information that's
Mm-hmm.
really user friendly for the general lay population.
And can you give some maybe client examples of that shame mode that people go into and the kind of etiology of that?
Yeah, I can give you a kind of brief overview. So first of all, it's important to understand, Andrew, the difference between shame and guilt. Guilt is a feeling of discomfort that you get when you've made a mistake. The thing about guilt is that you can usually fix your mistake, and guilt is healthy in that way. It helps us have a healthy degree of social consciousness. Shame, on the other hand, is a feeling of discomfort that comes when you believe you are a mistake.
Hmm.
So it's more toxic, it's more deadly, and it carries with it this belief, even though it's not accurate, it carries with it this belief that I'm inadequate in some way, and incorrectly so. We develop shame in environments where our needs aren't cared for in the way that we think they should be. And a lot of the harm doers that I work with grew up in families where fathers were abusive to mothers. They were abusive to them. They were told they don't measure up. They didn't hear words like "I love you" and "care about you." And so a lot of basic needs for nurturance were there. And they end up believing that there must be something wrong with me. I must be flawed. My parents would have given me what my little heart desires. And they carry that into adulthood. And the problem with shame, as we know as social workers and treatment providers, is that a basic need that we have is the need for connection.
Mm-hmm.
And here's a reference to Brene Brown. She says connections is so important. It's like it's in our DNA. Shame interferes with connection. And the reason that is because we don't want people to know that we feel inadequate. We don't want people to know that we don't believe we measure up. We don't want people to know that we're lacking something. And we get into a model called the scarcity model, where we say, I'm not blank enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not rich enough. I'm not educated enough. I'm not tall enough. I'm not handsome enough. I'm not pretty enough. The list goes on. Well, what happens is, because we don't want people to know we're in shame, we engage in 4 basic behaviors to keep people away. One is rage and hostility. We push against people who are trying to be critical in some way. We get into grandiosity, the belief that I'm either the very best or I'm the very worst, again, designed to keep people away from our shame. We get into perfectionism, and another name for perfectionism is people pleasing. So we try to do everything we can to keep people happy out of the belief if we can keep them happy, they will love us. Or we don't try at all. We get into procrastination, because the only thing worse than not trying and being criticized for not trying is to try and then fail with perfectionism. So that's kind of that middle piece where it goes from either perfectionism to procrastination. And the last behavior is withdrawal. People just withdraw. They make themselves little so they can't be seen. And so the problem with those behaviors, much the way that substance abusers use substances, is they're designed to have a remedy to the problem, which actually make the problem worse over time, because they don't fix it. They just give it a Band-Aid. So one of the things that we do when we work with harm doers is we practice vulnerability. We teach them the importance of emotional intelligence, identifying and understanding their feelings, how to express them through vulnerability, because vulnerability is the birthplace of connection.
Yeah.
And so we tell them, express your feelings and ask for what you want. And in that way, you start becoming authentic, and don't expect just because, especially if you're a harm doer, that if you start expressing your feelings to your intimate partners, that they're going to jump for joy and forget all the abuse that you put them through. It doesn't work that way, but at least you have a path for staying out of shame and a path toward improving communication in your relationship.
And that maps on really well with my work using transactional analysis, which you and I have talked about.
Right.
It's captured in that life position of I'm not okay, that there's something wrong with me, like you said, with the shame. I'm a mistake, and so the scarcity economy that you're describing, it's in transactional analysis, it's the stroke economy. So when people feel that shame, you can say, oh, Andrew, you're such a great podcast host or whatever. And it doesn't go through, right? In their head, they discount it and say, well, he's just saying that. And it makes me think about passivity strategies. This is what I focus on a lot with my patients is, like you said, perfectionism and procrastination. I mean, they tend to be two sides of the same coin. For people, I got to either do it and do it perfectly, or I'm not doing it at all, that kind of thing. But the first passivity strategy is doing nothing. You have a problem and you just, think the baby's crying and you're like, well, they always cry. You don't do anything about it. The other one is what's called over-adaptation. And I'd be curious how this connects with you. I talked with Julia a little bit about it. Over-adaptation is I'm going to take on the other person's goals as my goals primarily, this people-pleasing kind of tactic. And usually that's a lot of overthinking for people. Like, what does this person think of me? What do they want me to do? How are they feeling? All these assumptions. Mind reading, that, of course, leads to agitation. And everybody knows what agitation feels like, is you have this bound-up energy. You're restless. You're pacing your house. Of course, that isn't solving the problem, pacing around, but it feels active, feels like you're doing something with this energy. But then the way that people discharge that tension, agitation, is through violence or incapacitation. So, when I'm talking with patients, go ahead.
Well, here's the way it works with shame. So I came to this theory about shame and shame-based trauma by watching the men that I worked with. And for years, we spent our program focused on teaching conflict resolution skills and communication skills. And so Dan Saunders and I were doing some research to find out what's effective. And what I noticed is that there are three kinds of harm doers that go through treatment, and the outcome is some drop out and never make it through. Some make it through, but they're not successful. They don't do with the requirements, and some make it through and do well. And I was interested in the group of harm doers that do well. And even among that group, they got more quickly into the cycle of violence than than others. And I was always wondering, why is that the case? And of course, part of the problem is that they were never really able to acquire genuine empathy for the pain that they put their partners through. And so they would quickly get back into their abusive patterns of behavior. And so what happens is that when there's shame involved and your partner, let's say that you grew up in a family where you are repeatedly told you don't measure up, you're worthless, no matter what you do, it's not good enough. And you carry that shame with you. I'm inadequate. I'm not worthy of love and belonging. I'm not blank enough. And you're in a relationship and your partner says to you, what the heck's the matter with you? Don't you know any better than that? How could you be so stupid? And you don't focus on your behavior. Oh, she's not happy with my behavior. It goes to, she's telling me I'm a worthless piece of crap.
Uh-huh.
Because we go right to that shame message. When you are in the shame mode, Andrew, you have no ability to access your tools to respond in a way that's constructive. At that critical moment, you go right to a rage reaction. Your amygdala is activated, and the only thing you can do is figure out a way to keep your head above water for survival. You get into your defensiveness mode because it feels threatening for you. So part of the trick of treatment then is to have these guys slow it down, to really stay out of that shame, or if they're feeling shame, to back out of it, to be able to take a moment to pause, to reframe the situation in a way that they can come up with a constructive resolution and then respond. And it takes time because our limbic system is so oriented, that reptilian mind is so oriented as responding to quickly to threat to protect ourselves, that you really have to undo some of that biopsychophysiology, and it takes time to do that. But that's what happens when you're in shame. You have no time to think about it. You go right to that feeling threatened and wanting to defend yourself.
So you're really responding to those previous, kind of shame messages that you received as a young person. The person is maybe critiquing you, but you're responding to something internally, and then the work is in transactional analysis, we refer to it as the adult state, is coming back to reality. Is like, that's not what's actually happening.
Exactly.
It's not your dad attacking you, for example. Right. And let's think through, kind of, well, rationally, reasonably, but just sort of common sense, like that rage isn't an appropriate response in that context. And so you're slowing people down and getting them back to thinking, right?
Right. To go through their thought process, to do some cognitive restriction. Reframing is the lay term for that.
Yeah.
To, at that critical moment, when there's a critical moment and somebody says or does something that you have taken offense to or have some feelings about, you have two options. You can frame it in a way that allows you to escalate and respond in a way that makes your behavior the focus of negative attention, which never works, because the minute you make your method the focus, you lose your message. Or you can reframe it in a way that helps you slow down, to think it through, to figure out a positive response, to have a better outcome. And again, it takes time and practice, because every time we go through a constructive practice, we're laying down new neural pathways in your brain. We're changing your brain's chemistry, in a sense, which is quite phenomenal when you think about it. How can a role play help change your brain's chemistry? But the research is very clear. It does. And it makes a huge difference.
And, stepping back a moment, how did you personally get interested in doing this work? Why not working with eating disorders or people with, any other neuroses?
Yeah, it's a funny story. You want the long version or the longer version?
The extra long version.
So here's what happened. So I was a PhD student in the School of Social Work, and I had an advisor whose name was Sheldon Rose, and I was his teaching assistant for one of his courses. And one day I walked in his office and he says, have a seat. I've got some good news and I've got some bad news. And I said, well, what's the good news? And he said, well, I found you a new job. And I said, well, why do I need one? And he said, well, because the grant I was on didn't get refunded and I have no way to pay you. So I can't keep you on as a teaching assistant, but I found you a new job at Family Service in Madison with a former student of mine who's doing this group work and he needs some group therapists. And group psychotherapy was one of my areas of focus in my master's program.
Mm-hmm.
So I go trotting off to talk to this guy, Dan Saunders, and we hit it off. And so he hired me to do group facilitation with violent men. And I had no idea what I was getting into. So I jumped into the first group, and as the group progressed that particular evening, I remember kind of wanting to slide my chair closer to the door because I started to get a little worried, like, what did I get myself into here?
Right.
So it happened purely by accident that I got involved in doing this work. But once I got involved in it, I was totally fascinated in the transformation that I could see happening with these harm doers. And so I stayed in it, and over time, helped develop the program and add treatment options to it that weren't there in the beginning as we got better and smarter about best practice models in terms
Mm-hmm.
of how to work with harm doers.
Well, it's incredible work that you're doing with, people that have essentially been written off by society, less so now than in the 20th century. But what do you think about, court-ordered treatment? I imagine it's maybe different in Wisconsin than Minnesota, but it seems like the court system is decades behind. You hear people at least they call me and say, I need a mental health evaluation or I need anger management. And it's like, it's that or it's AA. It's like it hasn't caught up with the evidence, right?
Well, first of all, anger management is not the same as domestic violence intervention. They're
Right.
different
Yeah.
animals. If you treat domestic violence offenders or harm doers with an anger management model, you will create a better batterer, because domestic violence, one of the things it does in terms of the treatment intervention, it really challenges men's use of power and control, entitlement, and privilege, and you don't do that in anger management at all. Here's what I think. I think we've relied way too long on the carceral system, because it just hasn't proven to be successful over time. And one of my latest endeavors is to really focus on getting harm doer treatment out of the carceral system into a public health response system,
Mm-hmm.
where we start earlier and we educate people before they're involved with law enforcement, because most battered don't want their partners arrested anyway. They just want the abuse to stop. And so I'm really trying to work on models to help educate the public, help harm doers know that, in fact, there is help available for you. You don't have to wait until you get arrested. If you are doing things to harm the people that you claim that you love and care about, you don't have to keep doing that. And so getting that word out and coming at it from a public health initiative is one of my current endeavors that I'm putting some energy in. And so I think you're right, Andrew. The carceral system, the criminal justice system, is way behind, and simply arresting these guys and putting them in treatment hasn't proven to be effective long term. I mean, what Ed Gondolf says is that some abuser treatment is better than none, and so we have to recognize that, in fact, it does work, and in communities where there's domestic violence treatment for harm doers, it lets the community know that we're taking this problem seriously, and so that's a benefit as well. But I think we need to think about some different approaches to this issue.
Yeah, definitely. Now, you mentioned, a little bit of maybe fear or anxiety in that first group you stepped into. We have a segment now we're going to transition to. This is called Burn After Reading. So this is a book about Eric Berne. And so what the guests do, you're not in the studio here. So I selected a script question. Eric Berne was very interested in figuring out people's destiny, and he found all these similarities across generations, and he was helping people to figure out basically what was this show they kept putting on the road. I mean, it could be, violence in the home that gets repeated. But so question for you, what happens to your body when you get nervous? So this is a question that Berne would have asked in an assessment with a patient. What happens for you, or do you remember that time in that first group, how you felt in your body?
Well, certainly some anxiety. And so, Anxiety, as you know, is a form of fear. And the fear that most of us have as professionals, and you've probably experienced this yourself, is the fear of not knowing what to do,
Mm-hmm.
that fear that in some way I'm an imposter. And along with the physiological response, there's heightened breathing, there's a little bit of perspiration, some fidgeting that goes on along with that in terms of just physiological response. But more than that, there's an emotional cognitive response where there's this fear. What if they figure out I really don't know what I'm doing?
Mm.
I mean, I'll be a failure. And so I think that's as important to me as any anxiety that's physiologically based. The emotional basis for that is can be kind of debilitating.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And when I've been talking with my patients more recently about anxiety, I've been looking at it more from a psychoanalytic perspective. Wilhelm Reich has this concept of armoring, and I wonder what you think in terms of the batterers you've worked with. The idea is that we hold energy in different parts of our body. We contract or we inhibit feelings, we inhibit our breathing, and it creates this rigidity in the different muscular groups in the body. And so I've been working with people and kind of dissolving that armor. And I imagine with many of these batterers you worked with, they can, on the surface, they can be charismatic and polite and, very reserved. But below that layer is a lot of anger, like you said, rage before, fear, this shame. How do you actually work with people, maybe individually or in group, to get sort of underneath that? This is kind of a personal question, I guess, for me. I'm curious. How do you get underneath that armor, that rigidity with people?
Well, they don't think about it that way and they don't approach it that way. But what we do in our program, we spend a lot of time, Andrew, teaching them relaxation tools, and teaching them about their body's response. So we spend some time helping them identify when you're at a critical moment, when you're at a situation where you make the choice to be angry, what do you know is happening in your body physiologically? Because if you're going to change it, you have to know what it is that's going on
Yeah.
and how it's connected to what's emotionally what's happening. So we start with that to get that basically laid out. And then we teach them a combination of relaxation tools, progressive muscle relaxation, classical conditioning, and systematic desensitization that is really designed to help them at the critical moment. That's where they need it, Andrew. They need to be face to face at a time where there's a critical moment. Somebody is criticizing them. They're feeling put down. They're feeling disrespected. They elicited the shame response. They need to be able to tell themselves to be calm and relaxed, to take that deep breath, to take a step back, give themselves a moment to assess, okay, here's what I'm feeling. Why am I feeling that way? And how do I express that in a way that doesn't make my behavior the focus of negative attention? And so that's the approach that I have used with harm doers for 40 years.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now that you say that, it reminds me of some of my own anxiety issues in the past. We first got to know each other about 10 years ago. I was living in Madison, Wisconsin, and connected with the University of Wisconsin, as were you. And I joined your private practice, Midwest Center for Human Services. And I would, me, I'm a go-getter. I was trying to hustle and get clients right away, but I started sort of setting up my own shop. I'm very much programmed to be independent, and you kind of got to do it on your own, which of course is problematic. But I remember asking you about setting up a printer, like my own separate printer with my own separate internet and fax machine in my office. And this is a credit to you as a boss, a manager, however, clinical director, obviously, is you came to me and you said,
a friend and a mentor.
A friend and a mentor. Yeah, absolutely. You said, Andrew, you're not starting your own private practice. You're joining a group practice. And it really dissolved a lot of that anxiety. It was like, yeah, I'm not just doing this on my own, but thinking about it now, it was a little bit subversive, right? I was kind of undermining your authority by going in my own direction, I think. And that's part of the character structure for me. But you have to understand it, like you're saying, physiologically. It's one thing to know it up here in your head, but like what actually happens in your body when you're going through the shame or
Right.
the different
Right.
feelings. But did you pick up right
Well,
away that I
I
was
don't.
a subversive, or did that take a little
Well,
while for you?
I don't. You know what? It didn't seem subversive to me. What I saw is a young person who was starting out on a journey that he had not been in before, and what I saw was fear.
Hmm.
And so it was really clear to me that you were trying to do everything you could to avoid that feeling of fear, which is, anxiety based as well.
Yeah.
Um, so that leads me to a little commentary about an element of my work that I am really most proud of. And for years when I was doing this work with harm doers, the men that I work with come in, and in their own way, they're largely resistive in some way. Some of them are more oppositional, defiant, and more vocally so than others. Some of them are more passive aggressive in their resistance, but all of them are resistant in some way. And when I first started doing this work, my training taught me that what I have to do is forcefully challenge these guys and talk them out of their resistance.
Hmm.
Well, guess what? That didn't work so well because they were used to outlasting, any kind of pushback like that. And over time, what I came to,
And when
and
you
I
say,
thankfully
sorry to
this,
interrupt you, but when you say resistance, uh, they're blocking out affect, like emotions. They're not like getting into
oh,
how
it's
they're.
more basic than that. I
Oh,
mean, it
basic.
was sort of like, I don't want to be here.
Mm,
This is bullshit. I shouldn't have to be here. I'm not an abuser.
I see.
Um, it's more, I mean, I don't think at that level they're aware. I mean, they're so emotionally illiterate at that level, they're not even tuned into what their affective response really is to be able to label that. Now, one of the goals of intervention, of course, is to teach them to tune into that. But what I noticed is that I came upon this definition of fear that I really like. And the definition goes like this: fear is our body's natural reaction to coming closer to truth.
Mm,
And so there are two main truths that these guys had to come closer to. One is the admission that they were abusive. They had to come closer to that truth, that they had been abusive to their intimate partners and family members. And it takes time to get them to admit to that and even understand what abuse is. Like I said, most of them come in not knowing what abuse is. So that's one part of it. The second coming closer to truth is that they have to admit that they have no idea of how to fix it. And a lot of them come in, and of course, to admit that you don't know how to fix it means that you're admitting some sign of weakness. And we know that for male harm doers, that taps into their shame again, because one
mm,
of the biggest shame issues for men, which is different from women, is that they don't want to show any sign of weakness. And as I started tuning into their fear, rather than challenging them on their resistive behavior, it was a game changer. It just changed everything. And I could just sit back and smile when they're being resistive and I don't want to do this and this is crap and I shouldn't be here. And do you have a program for those women too? Because she's just as abusive as me. I would just sit back and I'm sure I had this catty little smile on my face because I knew where they were going to end up at the end. I knew that you can't be in this program for 14 months and not learn something and not come out of the other end of it learning how to be different. And so I would just relate to their fear and I'd say, boy, this is really going to be difficult for you because I'm really going to challenge you on some of your beliefs. And I can see that you're really afraid right now. Well, I'm not afraid of anything. Well,
uh-huh.
okay, well, here's what I see. And so when I started relating to their fear rather than pushing back on their opposition, you could see them change their attitude and their perspective. And I think it opened them up to really thinking about what they were doing in a different kind of way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And can you share any, obviously keeping confidentiality, but any examples of a kind of, personality that you would see and then how they changed over the course of treatment, in terms of a positive, successful outcome?
Sure. So I'll share a case that happened recently of a guy who came in and he was arrested because he shoved his partner when they were having a conflict. And she was standing outside on their front stoop and she was on like a third step and he pushed her and she fell off. the stair and was hurt, and he got arrested. And he came in and he was really angry about being referred to the program. He claimed that he was not an abusive person, and that he really didn't need to be there, and this program was overkill, and so on and so forth. And that was his attitude coming in. Over the course of the program, we talked about power and control and emotional abuse. He really started to understand that the physical abuse he did to his partner wasn't nearly as damaging as years and years and years of controlling his partner. She couldn't do anything without his commentary and control. She couldn't buy anything without his approval. If she bought something and he didn't approve, he'd make her take it back to the store. He would question her constantly about her behavior and things she was or wasn't doing, to the point where she really, kind of lost her identity. And as he began to understand that, what happened one day is he had a son who was a young man in his 20s. And the other thing that happened, let me back up a second, he had a horrible relationship with his adult daughter, because he would be verbally abusive to her as well and critical of her. And so one day his son had a baby, and they were at his house, and his son was talking to his marital partner in the same way that he used to talk to his wife. And he said, I watched my son, how he was treating his wife, and it was like an eye-opener for me. And I realized at that moment how abusive I'd been. And he started to cry in group, and he said, I can't tell you how ashamed I feel right now, and how ashamed I feel as I saw my son. And I know he learned that from me. I taught him how to behave that way. And he turned out from being one of the most defiant group members to being one of the most constructive group members, because he really understood what it was he was doing and what we were trying to do to help him. And time again, he would bring in successes, and he got to the point where other men would kind of regress a bit. He would call them out. He did it well using the tools from the program, but he'd say, it seems to me that you're in denial right now, or et cetera, et cetera. So that's an example of kind of what I'm talking about.
Yeah. And I assume the majority of your patients are coming through like some sort of legal apparatus or something, like it's not necessarily a voluntary treatment situation?
No, actually, that's wrong. The majority are either partner mandates or voluntary. Partner mandates are that their partners say, "I'm leaving you," or and I'm not coming back to you, get help, or they're already left and they say, "I'm not coming back to you, get help," or they come referrals come through other sources like defense attorneys or people who've been through treatment, former satisfied patients, if you will. A large percent, only about 40% though, come through the court system, and most of those come through what's called a deferred prosecution program in the county, in Dane County, where I live. But actually, the majority of the men that I work with are not court referred, which is kind of interesting. What's also interesting is that I don't separate the men out. I don't put the court ordered men with just court ordered men. I mix them together, which is great, because the men who are court ordered are angry about being there and think that they've been unjustly accused, and that I'm part of the system, and et cetera, et cetera. And they don't want to be there. The men who come voluntarily challenge them to say, I really want to be here. I want to change. I need to change because my family's fallen apart. So it kind of helps balance the group out in that respect, which is really an interesting dynamic.
And, for people listening, either for themselves or, family members, friends, how do they know they might need to seek out this kind of, batterer treatment? What would you say to those people that aren't connected to services currently?
Say that again?
That aren't connected to services currently, that are maybe thinking about it.
Sure. First of all, it's important to know that help is available in most communities, and that change is possible. I mean, I have seen tremendous transformations over the years that I've been doing this work, and for people to say work with domestic violence harm doers, men, doesn't work, I would say to them, well, I'm living and walking and breathing testimony to challenge that. Because if it didn't work, I would have been out of business a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
What I'd say to people is that help's available. It does work. Don't wait until you get into the court system. Do something proactively before it ever gets to that point.
Mm-hmm. And this is kind of a throwaway question, but it came to me at about 10 o'clock last night, and you've spoken to it. Is power a drug?
Well, I don't know if it's a drug per se. I think when it comes to power, I think America has a love affair with power to the point where people think when it comes to power, some is good, more is better, and too much is just right. There are people who have talked about being addicted to power, being addicted to, control. It's not an addiction in the normal way that we think about addictive behaviors. But I think that power can be overused. I think it can be used in a way that's destructive. And, there is constructive power. I mean, all of us benefit from ability to have some power over what happens in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the way harm doers use power. They use power to control other people. And the power principle really comes into play. And the power principle goes like this. People who have very little power, or at the point where they perceive that they have very little power, in a cultural or society system that says when it comes to power, it's important to have some, overuse what little power they have when they don't have it. What power do harm doers have to overuse? They have the power to be controlling, destructive, and abusive to get what they want. The problem with that is that the minute you make your method trumps your message, you lose every time. Because once you make your behavior the focus of negative attention, you give up your right to hold other people accountable for their behavior. So that's how I would answer that question. Sort of a non-answer to your question.
Well, it's really more the acquisition and maintenance of power, I guess, is maybe a better way of putting it. You know that I'm working on a manuscript that focuses on fascism, and that seems to be the central kind of thread, is this craving for power and maintaining it basically at any means necessary. I did a quick, Google search before we met here this morning. Do you have a guess at what country or countries has the highest prevalence of violence towards women?
Well, I would say that United States ranks up there pretty high. Let me think. I used to know the answer. It seems to me Great Britain was pretty high. And I don't remember the rest.
So again, I don't have the studies on this, but in 2019, Pakistan had the highest prevalence, 85% of women experiencing physical or sexual violence in a partnership. And then 2020, Reuters did a poll, and India ranked the most dangerous country for women, facing violence. Any comments you want to make on that?
Well, I mean, in regimes where there is a very strong patriarchal structure in place, so a lot of Middle Eastern countries that have that in place, you're going to see probably more violence against women. I'm surprised the United States, I'm sure the United States, well, maybe I was thinking about gun violence rather than domestic violence. But I think any country that really exudes privilege, entitlement, and power and control and those kinds of privileges, if you will, extended to men, are going to see a lot more violence against females.
That hierarchy, as men being elevated, more powerful, stronger leaders, and women are just these baby maker kind of machines. It's really interesting how that isn't shifting, by and large. Obviously, what the work you're doing and what we're talking about, Brene Brown, is trying to dispel these myths. Many of my patients, not batterers or involved in domestic violence, they have this what's called a driver, meaning pushing them, propelling them forward in terms of their script, is be strong. So like you're saying, you know, that resistance, that opposition is like, I got to be a tough guy. I got to be, you know, guys don't cry, you know, and that masculine.
Real men stand tall and alone.
Right, right. Well, this has been an enlightening conversation. Thanks again for taking the time today to talk with us. Anything you want to end with or direct people in terms of resources?
Well, you know, there are national hotlines. There are national groups. I would say that in terms of information, check with your state coalition against domestic violence to find out what services are available. They have their fingertips on intervention for male harm doers. But just know that treatment works. Try to get there earlier rather than later so that you're not doing harm and creating the next generation of harm doers who are shame-based because of the trauma that they experienced is a message that I wanted to put out. I would put out there to the world, actually.
Right. Yeah. I want to emphasize that, again, going back to transactional analysis, that idea of I'm okay, you're okay. You know, we've all had problems and done things we regret and don't want to do again, and, you know, have experienced violence in some way or another, but that treatment is effective. There's ways to deal with that, you know, that concept of armoring, to let go a lot of that conditioning that, like you said, I mean, in these hierarchical structures, that just gets reinforced. You know, the strong survive is that, you know, extreme version. So thanks so much, Darald. Always a pleasure talking with you.
Pleasure.
Yeah. Have a good day. Thanks for tuning in. This is On Mind with Andrew Archer. Take care.